Good afternoon, everyone. It looks like we have been able to get just about everyone in this afternoon. And I want to welcome all of you to Race and Unity. How can I be an advocate for racial equality? I'm Keith Gamble, a middle school music teacher from Evansville and president of the Indiana State Teachers Association. We begin by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional lands served by the Miami, Osage, and Shawnee people. We honor America's first people and all elders, past, present, and emerging, and we are called on to learn and share what we learn about the tribal history, culture, and contributions that have been suppressed in telling the story of America. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I will say to all of you, as I do to everyone at all of our gatherings, if no one has said I love you today, I want you to know that I do. I hope everyone is healthy and taking good care of yourself. I want to extend my sincere thanks to the members of the ISTA Minority Affairs Committee for developing today's panel discussion. The pandemic may have changed the way we work right now, but it has not changed that we must do this work. And so again, I thank you all so much for being here today. Some instructions as we move forward in today's meeting. We want to make sure that everyone keeps their line muted so that we do not pick up any of your background noise. Again, if you are on social media, that we ask that you tag us on Twitter at ISTA members. And we are recording this event. I know there have been storms across the state, and we've had reports from different areas of power outages. So we will be able to share this recording with other members. And there have been in the chat room various hashtags that have been provided that you can include in today's event. And we certainly hope that you will take advantage of all of that as well. And so without further ado, let me introduce our panel today. Our panelists are Michael Twyman, PhD, is managing principal of In Excelsis LLC, a full services consulting firm that works with organizations seeking to maximize their performance and effectiveness. Dr. Twyman is a subject matter expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also teaches courses on racial equity at the IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. His 30-year career includes holding several senior leadership positions in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Patricia Pat Payne, ISTA retired member, began her career as a classroom teacher of young children from 1962 to 1987, when she was appointed to design and direct the IPS Crispus Attucks Center. Following retirement in 2014, she returned to IPS and presently directs the IPS Racial Equity Office. She has served IPS for over 58 years. She attended Indianapolis Public Schools, kindergarten through 12th grade. Pat earned her BA degree from Indiana University Bloomington, her master's degree and administrative license from IUPUI, and received an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Martin University. And Dawn Knight. Dawn is an English teacher at Westfield High School. Dawn is an ISTA member, and she is the author of Race and Football in America, The Life and Legacy of George Talfiero, which won a gold award from the Independent Publisher Book Awards. The chairs of the ISTA Minority Affairs Committee. Angie Kirkham is a fourth grade teacher in Columbus, and Ronald Swan is president of the Indianapolis Education Association. Thank you to both Angie and Ron, and I will hand the meeting over to them at this time. Thank you both so much, and thank you all again for joining us today.
Ron, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith. These are learning objectives for this webinar. Encourage educators to accept discomfort in discussing race, raise awareness personally and professionally of racial equity issues, learn how to practice racial equity personally and professionally.
Okay, next we will be watching a video, and this video is called Debunking the Most Common Myths White People Tell About Race. It is by Robin DiAngelo, who's the author of White Fragility, and in the video she's going to unpack some common excuses and how to address them.
To be white in so many ways is to be raised to be functionally illiterate on the topic of race. I am white, and part of being white is that I was not raised to see myself in racial terms. I mean, I understood that somebody had race, but not really me. To be white is to see oneself outside of race, to see oneself as a unique, special individual, exempt from the forces of socialization. I'll never forget a moment of standing beside a black man leading a workshop on race, and a white woman said to him, "I don't see color." He said, "Well, then how are you going to see racism?" "Because I am black. I do think you know that, and I have a different experience than you do. And you're not going to be able to understand that, and you're not going to be able to support the parts of that experience that are really painful and problematic if you refuse to acknowledge my reality." I don't see color is really a way of saying I refuse to acknowledge your reality. What's important about that narrative is it reveals what the person thinks racism is. So if the person is using proximity, fondness across race as evidence of a lack of racism, in order for that to be good evidence, a racist must not be able to do that. So that rests on an understanding that a racist cannot tolerate proximity to people of color. And I'm hoping that we can see that's pretty absurd, because trust me, even avowed racists can tolerate being around people of color, and often are. You cannot talk about any other issue without talking about how race informs that issue. And when someone says it's about class, that tends to function as a way to get race off the table. First of all, we're already divided by race. And focusing on race is not what did it. I would say not focusing on race, refusing to grapple with how race shapes virtually everything is what keeps us divided. And that is a very white narrative. All of those narratives function to get race off the table, close the exploration, exempt the person from any further engagement, and protect the racial hierarchy and the white position with it, which is an unequal hierarchy. The challenge I want to offer my fellow white people is changing the question from if to how. So dominant culture asks if I'm racist, and I want to change that question to How have I been shaped by the forces of racism? How is racism manifesting in my life? Because it circulates 24/7, 365. None of us can be and none of us were exempt from its forces. And this is where individualism can come in. I have a particular story, but that story didn't exempt me. And so I can ask myself, how did all the things I see as unique about me set me up into the overall racist structure? Because it did.
Okay, next we are going to go over some definitions that are critical to this discussion. And I'd like to welcome our lead panelist, Dr. Twyman, to go over these definitions with us.
Yeah, framing is, of course, very important. And we're going to be doing some deep dives in terms of our questions and the responses that our panelists will be sharing. And so I thought it would be helpful if we would be grounded in some of the terminology. One, I'm going to start off with talking about prejudice, which we all have. They are prejudgments, often unjustifiable, not grounded in any reality, more so perception. They tend to be negative. It is an attitude of one type of individual or group towards another group and its members. Oftentimes, these negative attitudes are typically based on generalizations. Be careful of any statement about an individual or a group of people using the word all. If you remember back for when you were in either grade school or you may even teach this, when we have multiple choice tests, be leery of the answer that says all. Rarely, if anything in life, applies to everybody, and in all situations, there's always exceptions. So it denies the right of individual members or certain groups to be recognized or treated as individuals. Such prejudices can be also expressed through a term that we call implicit bias. Implicit bias is uncontrolled, but can be managed thoughts that we all have stored in our brains that we assign meaning to, that oftentimes are against our own personal values, but they have shaped how we see each other and how we see certain situations. In other cases, our biases are expressed very explicitly, and we'll talk about the difference of that as we move forward. Next. So, what is race? First of all, it is a social construct that artificially, and artificially is a key word, divides people into distinct groups based on characteristics. Start off with physical appearance. By and large, skin color, which is a very faulty science because skin color comes in all different shades and all different groups of people that we have even identified as having a racial makeup, but also can include ancestral heritage, cultural affiliation, cultural history, ethnic classification, and the political needs of a society at a given period. Again, socially constructed. There is no scientific, biological, or genetic basis for race. Scientists agree on that. There are more variation in species of fruit flies than there are in Homo sapiens, which we all are. So race is an artificial construct. Race is a myth. And moving on to the next slide, racism is a fact. So sounds like an oxymoron. Race, I just said, is a myth. It's a fiction. Now I'm going to argue that racism is a reality and a fact. Why do I say that? Racism is a system of advantage based on race, a system of oppression that's based on race, a way of organizing society based on dominance and subordination that is predicated on one's racial classification. Penetrates every aspect of our personal, cultural, and institutional life. It includes prejudice against people of color, as well as exclusion, discrimination against, suspicion of, fear and hate of people of color. Simple definition, it is prejudice, which we talked about 2 slides ago, and then the power to implement the prejudice. Power being capitalized as significant because without having the critical mass of social, political, and economic power, by definition, persons of color cannot be racist. Persons of color, by definition, cannot be racist. White privilege, or historically accumulated white privilege, as we have come to call it, refers to whites' historical and contemporary advantages in access to quality education, decent jobs, and livable wages, home ownership, retirement benefits, wealth, and so on. Peggy McIntosh, if some of you are familiar of her work that goes all the way back to the 80s, as a white person, I had been taught about racism that puts others at a disadvantage, but had been taught not to see one of its corollary aspects, white privilege, which puts me at an advantage. White privilege is an invisible package of unearned, I'm going to underscore the word unearned, assets, which I can count on cashing in every day of my life, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious of. So continuing to benefit from it, but not ever being admonished or reminded of the fact that it's unearned. Moving on. So what is racial equity? We talked about race, we talked about racism. Racial equity refers to what a genuinely non-racist society would look like. Now, there are people who would argue after the election of Barack Obama that we as a nation moved into a post-racial society. Highly arguable. In a racially equitable society, the distribution of society's benefits and burdens would not be skewed, influenced, or determined by race and race alone. In other words, racial equity would be a reality in which a person is no more or less likely to experience society's benefits or burdens just because of the color of their skin. This is very much in contrast to our current state of affairs, in which a person of color is more likely, 1, to live in poverty, be in prison, to drop out of high school, be unemployed, experience poor health outcomes, and potentially fatal diseases. Racial equity demands that we pay attention not just to individual level discrimination, but to overall social outcomes. Next. So, systemic, or sometimes called structural racism, a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group identity, racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. It is a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. Structural racism or systemic racism analysis pays attention to the historical, cultural, and social psychological aspects of our currently racialized society. I failed to say that race, in the scheme of things, if we look at the origin of civilizations and the evolution of civilizations, race as we know it today, skin color, race, and racial classification is essentially about 400 to 500 years old. It is a relatively new phenomenon. People say, oh no, it's been around since the very, very beginning. People have always been into categories in terms of race. Not true. If we study and really understand history, yes, people have always found ways to divide themselves. But normally the distinctions, particularly in earlier civilizations, were around geography, religion, and language. This idea of race as we know it, predicated on skin color, is new in the evolution of humankind. Institutional racism refers to the policies and practices within and across institutions that intentionally or not produce outcomes that chronically favor or put a racial group at a disadvantage. Examples of this can be found in school disciplinary policies in which students of color are punished at much higher rates than their white counterparts. In the criminal justice system, lots of examples there. And within many employment sectors in which day-to-day operations, as well as hiring and firing practices, can significantly disadvantage workers of color. Next. Individual racism can include face-to-face or covert actions toward a person that intentionally express prejudice, hate, or bias based on race. That includes microaggressions. The beliefs, attitudes, and actions of individuals that support or perpetuate racism can occur at both a conscious and an unconscious level and can be active or passive. Examples include telling a racist joke, using a racial epithet, or believing in the inherent superiority of whites. Is that our last? All right. So I know I got a lot of smart people on the line and are tuned in, so you absorbed all of that in real time. The references will be available to you later, but hopefully you were familiar with many of those definitions. In some cases, it may have been new learning, but that's how we're going to ground our conversation today. So at this point, I believe we are ready to speak to our panelists and to start some questions, and as well as give opportunity for those of you who are listening in, if you have a question as we're talking, or particularly as we are unpacking a particular topic, we will see those as best we can. If it requires some immediate attention, we will do just that. And if not, we might put it in the parking lot for a minute as we continue on with the dialogue. So I assume that both Pat and Dawn are now unmuted. I can't see them on my screen just yet. Okay, yep, very good. We ready?
Ready.
I think so.
All right, good enough. Well, I'm gonna start off maybe with a softball question, but maybe it's not such a softball question. I wanna go back to Robin DiAngelo's comments in the video, and maybe we agree or disagree with her. And so I'd be interested to hear both of your perspectives on this one question. Do we as a society, particularly here in America, find it difficult and uncomfortable to discuss the issue of race? And then probably more importantly, racism. So, or is it easy to do?
It's difficult. It's difficult for people to discuss race and racism. And it's not just difficult for white people to discuss it. It's difficult for people of color to also discuss it, even though we live the experience every day. But I have found in my experience, especially with the Indianapolis Public Schools now, we are doing sessions every month with our principals to help them feel more comfortable discussing race with the people that they work with every day. And I guess it's because sometimes you just don't want to step on people's toes talking about race, or you just have never done it before. But I think particularly now in this day and time, it is going to be necessary for all of us to start talking about race, because if we don't talk about race, then the same mistakes that we've always made in terms of how Black and brown children are treated in the classroom, in the society, will continue to be made.
Yeah, I
Thank you.
agree. I think it's not okay anymore, especially for white people, to stay out of this conversation. And I know it is uncomfortable, and that's why I think a lot of times it doesn't happen. And sometimes it's that, you know, you feel like you don't know enough about it, or you might accidentally offend someone, or it's not about me. And I think that's dangerous. And actually, the stepping on the toes comment is actually something that I said yesterday to the panelists when we had a discussion. And I said, I'm not sure I should be here. But I should. And I think that we kind of need to give people permission to have a difficult conversation and say, it's okay if you say something wrong. We're not going to move forward or grow until we start having those uncomfortable conversations.
Exactly right. So let's go back in time just a little bit. What is your understanding of what the history and origin of public education is in America? Where did it start? Who was it for? Who was it not for? What when we think about early America, what do we think about public education, particularly at that time?
When we think about it. When you say that question, it just brings to mind Brown versus the Board of Education. For some reason, that's what it brings to mind, because I think that is even when, I hate to even say the word, when charter schools started, because people did not want their children going to school with with Black children. And so it's somewhere in there that I think public education had its beginnings because of that.
Well, and of course, that's 1954, and we had been around quite a few
Long time.
years before then. So, and yeah, but we'll come back to Brown versus Board of Education. So think about early schools. First, who even got to go to school, number one, and who was teaching in the early schools?
Who got to go to schools? I know that I'm talking to myself now. I should be talking.
You know, I'm thinking of Frederick Douglass right now, I guess, as an English teacher, but I mean, he had to teach himself how to read and write because it was illegal for slaves to learn. And I think that I teach my students about that because I want them to value and understand the importance of education. There's a reason we keep people from education. It's much easier to hold people down when they don't have education. And I don't know if that's kind of where we're going with this, but we know that there's still an issue and that there's inequity in our school systems. And I think that we're still struggling with that same issue, that people aren't getting the same opportunities because they're still not getting that valuable education.
Exactly.
Yeah, you hit it. That's exactly where I was going. To be more candid and frank, our public education system was built in a racist context from the very beginning. So it's not really much of a surprise when we look at inequities today, and then we trace our history. And to your point, slaves were not allowed to even learn how to read, less alone for a number of years to be able to go to schools. Public schools, and of course not private schools. And that's true in elementary, secondary, and then of course our colleges and universities for a number of years. and hence the establishment of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities in the 1860s, post-Reconstruction. So I say that to say, historically, things just don't magically get out of the water. We have a way in our country of institutionalizing things, and it takes a long, long time for us to undo things that are systemic and structural, hence the definitions around what even structural racism is. And if you think about it in terms of holding even the current education system within a larger historical framework, we begin to understand how some of the inequities, particularly around race, continually manifest and get perpetuated. Because essentially we're trying to write something that is a part of who we are as a country, if we're being truthful about it, because it's a part of how we made it structural and we've institutionalized a lot of it. So yeah, there's that. So one of the questions was, how do we distinguish equality from equity, particularly as it relates to race? Because some people use the terminology interchangeably, and the definitions do have distinct meanings.
Mm-hmm. Equality means sameness, and equity means fairness. So you can give somebody the same set of books, but that may not be what their needs are to be educated. So, and I hear that all the time, this interchangeable way of using equity and equality. And a lot of people always use that that little cartoon type where you see the three children standing looking at a baseball game.
Yes.
Yeah, and the last one, well, it used to just be two. Now it's three. I've even seen one with four where they finally take the whole fence away so everybody can see everything. And then the last slide said liberation. See, so it's a distinct difference. And I don't think that as I experience what I see in the schools, there's a lot of equity going on yet. And that's where we need to be going.
Great. Dawn, would you add anything to that definition or meaning?
No, I think that's, yeah, I think it's really important to distinguish between the two, because I think, we don't have equality until we have equity. We have to be able to provide students with opportunities for like we were just talking about with education. We know there are inequities in that system. And so we need to be able to do what we need to do to make sure that there is equity there so that all students can learn and have those same opportunities.
Because if I just might add, some people might think that equality is offering, talent and gifted classes. But when you go into those classes, you rarely see any children of color in those classes. So the system may be offering it to everybody, but everybody does not have the advantage of being in those classes. However, if you go into special education classes, it's exactly the opposite.
That's a great point. I think our equity team at school is looking at, we're currently doing an audit of things like that in discipline, for example, but we're also looking at our AP and honors levels classes. And we want to look at all aspects of the school and audit everything to see where we are not having equity.
Right.
What do you say to your colleagues who might say from time to time, well, I just see kids. I just see my students. I don't see color. Dr. D'Angelo had a comment about the issue of being colorblind. I just don't see color. What are the implications from a statement like that, particularly for a classroom teacher who, for some reason other than some optical malady, does not see color?
Dawn, you want to take this first? I keep going first. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really important concept because I've been guilty of saying that in the past. And I think it's, this is all about learning and growing. And I think that was something really important to hear. You think it's good if you say, I don't see color. And actually it's very problematic. And that's something that I think people need to realize. My Black students have been through a lot. And I need to see that and recognize that in order to give them equity in my classroom. I think that's an incredibly important learning for everybody and growth for everyone. So I agree with it. And I think it's something that I was in all good intentions saying, I don't see color, but that's not good. It's problematic.
I just wanted to say, if I can add, I was looking for be able to raise my hand, but when you don't see color, then you don't see me. When you ignore color, you ignore racial inequalities that take place, unfortunately, every second.
Okay. That's exactly what I was getting ready to say. In fact, you don't see me. And when you hear people say, well, I treat everybody the same. First of all, they're not being truthful. If you're saying you don't treat, and they're not being truthful either if they say I don't see color. Please,
right.
I have a problem, and when I hear someone saying that, I know right away you're gonna be one of our problems immediately. Yeah, because if you don't know who your children are, then you're operating on negative assumptions. You're operating on stereotypes, you see. And like one stereotype is that all Black children are poor. People immediately think that and treat them exactly like that. So these assumptions are very, very damaging.
Mm-hmm.
Extremely dangerous, which brings me to my next question. Many of our colleagues that are joining us today are in communities all across the state, some with various demographic makeup and composition, very different from our capital city of Indianapolis. And so I will hear oftentimes, well, I don't really need to bother with talking about race because we don't have any diversity in our town or in our community, or there are no Hispanic kids in our school, so why do I need to talk anything that has to do with people who are Hispanic? So talk to me about why is it important, or is it important, that educators who may not have racial diversity well represented either in their class, school, or community have probably even a greater obligation in terms of what they teach and how they unpack issues around race and racism?
Mm-hmm. I think it's very important, especially if you are teaching a classroom full of just white students, that they are able to understand that they aren't the only ones in this universe. First of all, since we live in a globally, a global universe almost, if they go out and get a job, they may have been summa cum laude, I just made up a word, in their class, but they may fail miserably in the workplace if they are not able to get along and respect those who are different from them. See?
Yeah.
We have a question. So what do we do to help one see me or my son? We are mixed race. I would like to be seen as Rosa, not a race, not a color. Yet, yes, that's part of who Rosa is, But how do we get that mindset? What can I do?
One of the things that I often tell students, and I honestly and truly believe it, being a scholar in race and racism, is that in terms of racial identity, you can be whoever you want to be, whoever you say you are. Because if we understand that race is a social construct, you can choose to identify however you want. That, however, does not stop the rest of the world seeing you how they see you, which you have no control over. So in many ways, and it does get very complex, in terms of biracial, multiracial, arguably we all are. So
Really?
again, we're talking about a very artificial construct here. So it's how you present, it's how you identify. I wish that we were a world that did not assign value and meaning and purpose to people based on their skin color. That's where it's not so much an issue of seeing folks in different shades or even putting them into racial categories or groups. It's all the stuff that comes along with it. The other things that we assign to it that may, and in most cases do not apply to the individual is, and so I don't know if I'm answering Rose's question. I don't know how you get people to see you other than how you present. I do know you have a choice of identifying with whatever is comfortable for you in terms of your racial identity. And if it's a biracial identity, so be it. If it's white, if it's whatever it is, people get to choose that. People get to choose that. But it doesn't stop other people from putting you into their own categories and boxes.
Yeah, people get
Dawn
to choose.
or Pat?
Yeah, I was going to say people get to choose it, but also when you're driving down the street, you better be concerned about how police are seeing you. If you are biracial and you look African American, if you look more on the African American side or the Latinx side, then you better be concerned about police identifying you as that and treating you so. So I guess what I'm saying is it's very important that I tell parents, you have to, if someone's biracial, you got to teach them both their cultures. And it may be 3 or 4 cultures. They have to be exposed to the goodness of all cultures that they are a part of. But you got to be careful if you're driving down the street. That's the point I want to make. Be careful if you think you're a light-skinned person and that's who you identify with, and you don't think the Black part of you makes any difference, or you trying to hide it, you better be careful if you're trying to hide it from the police, because they will treat you as they see you.
And that was very much my point, that we have no control how the rest of the world sees us. Again, you can be who you want to be, but it doesn't stop others from seeing you as they see you.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm thinking as teachers in considering this, because what I heard in this question was, I don't want to just be looked at by my race. And I think that's a very valid point, because we had just talked about not seeing color and how that's dangerous and problematic. So I think as teachers, it's very important that we see color so that we know the experiences that come along with that, but also that we don't just see color. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense. It's an either and or both, because give the example of Pat and myself. She's female, I'm male. We're of a slightly different age. There are certain experiences that she's had as an African-American woman of a certain age that I have not had as an African-American male. There are many things that we will share in common as a part of a shared tradition and culture of being African-American, but our journeys are very different. So there'll be things very individual to each of us, as is true for everyone else who's in our race. And so to your point, yes, it's both. It's knowing and getting to know people individually, which takes time and building a relationship and a rapport. And it's also understanding the things about their culture that are a part of who they are as well.
But the danger, I have to repeat, comes in when you're making assumptions about people, when you're making negative assumptions about people and assigning stereotypes to them, because that's exactly how you will treat them in the classroom.
Yes. Well, okay, let's double down a little bit more on that, because it gets into the issue of essentially racial discrimination, because you have made the case that if you're using your prejudgments, your biases, and or stereotypes about a group of people and applying it to an individual, i.e. your student, because he or she is a byproduct of that larger group that you have issues with, or have certain things that you believe about all of them, which I told you be careful the word all, because nothing applies to all. What, on a day-to-day basis, talk a little bit more, Pat, about how that manifests in the classroom when someone moves from their individual bias and prejudice about a group of people and begin to apply it in a negative way to a person of color in the classroom.
And you know,
how does it show up? What does it look like?
First of all, let me say this. This doesn't just apply to white teachers either, because it also applies to teachers of color, you know, who are, I was thinking back to my second grade classroom because I've made the same mistakes that I am sharing with you now, because this is a journey we're on, and we're all on it, and we're still learning. We're all still learning. And so when you apply those kinds of things in the classroom, sometimes that's why you're sitting, and sometimes you don't even know you're doing this. You see all the Black children or brown children are sitting in the back of the room, or you have Black and brown children, you may ask a question and they're just waving their hands wildly, but you don't even see them. You don't see them, and you're calling on somebody else that you probably think will have the right answer, and that's probably not the Black or brown child. And the more this goes on, when Black children aren't seen, or when the brown children aren't seen, they just start withdrawing from the process. Sorry about that phone ringing, nothing I can do about it. They just start withdrawing from the process, because really the teacher has already withdrawn from the process as far as that child is concerned.
Yeah, and I think this comes from, you know, at the very beginning, where all of the television shows and news, you know, if I'm actually in the middle of reading White Fragility right now, and there is just a list of all of these items that what we read, what we watch, the films, the commercials, everything is, you know, anywhere from 85 to 100% decided by white people. And so we, before we even know it, already have these biases because our brain makes patterns from all of these things. And even as teachers, we're going to do those things, as Pat just said, call on the kid that we think is going to have the answer. If it's a science class, that might be a boy instead of a girl. But it's these patterns that we've developed that we don't even know are there. And it's so important to learn about those and understand them, and actually very consciously make decisions to try to make up for that.
I have a question I have a question in the chat. The question is regarding the comment that was made about light skins having to be careful about the police because the police will treat you as they see you. So the question is, does that mean all police or white police?
I'll take a stab at that, which gets to the issue that Pat talked about, even in terms of Black teachers and Black educators. She didn't use the terminology internalized racism, but essentially that's often at play. And even persons of color, when you understand structural and systemic racism, can be players and enablers of racist behaviors, policies, and practices, okay? So the answer to your question is yes. Even individuals who are actors, sometimes even unbeknownst to them, in a larger culture system, can be guilty of behaviors that are grounded in racist attitude. So therefore, in fact, when I was doing racial equity work in Little Rock, Arkansas, the chief of police said in a community meeting that the reason why his officers are in Black neighborhoods more than other neighborhoods because Blacks commit more crime. Show me the data on that. Go to some white neighborhoods and over police them and find out how much crime you'll see. So this, but again, and he was an African-American, first African-American chief of police of Little Rock Police Department. So to your question, yes, even individuals who are persons of color often can see other people of color in ways that whites see them, that are grounded in white superiority and suspicion of Black and brown people.
And you mentioned it, but I want to emphasize the internalized racism, because we as African Americans have all of this negativity coming at us 24/7. It comes at us in the classroom, it comes at us through the media, and you start believing some of that stuff. And when you start believing it, you start acting it. And it's always coming, and which is another reason we as educators are so important in the lives of children, because sometimes that's the only time they will hear positive things. If they have an educator or teacher who believes in them, who has seen the brilliance that they bring to the classroom, and that's what we should be looking for. When that child comes through the door, we should be welcoming the brilliance that this child, the experience that this child brings with him or her through that doorway, and work on it and develop it so that they see. That's why sometimes there are children that they just don't want to go to certain teachers' rooms because they know what's going to happen. And then they go to another teacher's room. They can't wait to get there because that teacher believes in them and that teacher is welcoming to them, can't wait to see them, and makes a difference in that child's life.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question. What political and social policies do we need to adjust, change, or alter in order to ensure that equitable treatment occurs in our society?
Yeah, let me park that in the parking lot for a moment. That's a weightier one, and I promise I'll get to it more towards the end when we start to wrap up about things that we can do on a real practical level. So just let me hold that question. Let me ask this relative to a point or something I shared with the group yesterday as we were preparing for today, that parents are our students first, and they are their primary teachers. How important is it when we're not in our professional roles, that what we do and say in our homes, in our social circles, that tend in most instances to be very racially segregated, despite the multicultural landscape of our country and of our state and cities. But nonetheless, how important is it that when we are outside of our professional roles, that when there are the conversations around race and racism, and I would also even ask, particularly from our white colleagues, when there are opportunities to engage in the conversation around race within your own, amongst yourselves, what do we say or do anything different than when we're in our professional roles? Is it one life we live outside of the classroom and another one in the classroom? Should there be some consistency between the two?
Are you asking that to the panelists? Are you asking?
I am.
Yeah.
There should definitely be consistency between the two. You can't be at school all day and say I'm not a racist and then go home and be talking about black people or brown people like a dog. You are a racist. It's not something you can turn off and on. It's got to be part of who you are. It's a lifestyle. That's what it is. It's a lifestyle. So you can't. I thought you were going someplace else with the parent when you said parents, but I'll wait till you come back to that.
Okay, all right.
I agree. It needs to be consistent. I'm probably a little more political outside of school because I try to keep politically neutral. It's been harder and harder. But I do think that it's important still to have those conversations, because the problem goes well beyond school. School is a great place to expose kids to different cultures and to address issues like that. But I think that it's obviously out there in the community and it's out there in society, and we need to address it there as well. And this gets back to that difficult conversation thing, being uncomfortable. A lot of people don't want to have this conversation because in some ways they don't want to learn that about themselves. They're much more comfortable just saying I'm colorblind and moving on with their day, or I have black friends, or any number of things that we know are those excuses. And so I think it's extremely important to have those conversations in public, not just social media. I love people doing book clubs right now. And I've, in the last couple of weeks, I've had more and more people ask about book clubs and using books as a way to start difficult conversations, because it gives them something specific to talk about. And I think that's so important. I love that.
Dr.
Thanks.
Twyman,
yes.
we have another question.
Okay.
As a minority teacher teaching in a rural school where the majority of the staff and students are white, how do I initiate the conversations needed with colleagues, administration, etc.? How can we bring the necessary conversations into rural schools and see tangible results?
Great. Our panelists, Pat, that was similar to the question that we asked before about the importance of, particularly in segments of our state where there's not a great deal of racial diversity. How do you start those conversations?
Well, Dawn just gave one excellent way, and that is have book clubs, have readings, have time, make time. I always have to laugh when I tell teachers to make time. We hardly have time for anything. But book study groups are a good way to do that. When I would hear teachers making statements that were not appropriate, sometimes I would tell teachers who didn't feel comfortable, just if they heard something in the teacher's lounge that was inappropriate. Some people don't feel comfortable just coming right out and blasting people down. So I told them there were times when I just find an article and place it in that teacher's mailbox. And, you know, you have to find other ways of doing things to help people enter into this space that we want them to enter into, where they'll start feeling comfortable or begin to approach you to help them find things that'll help them be more comfortable. There are some people that will never feel comfortable dealing with race, and you have to understand that too. And that's the person that should not be in the classroom.
Yeah, I have a couple of things. And Dr. Twyman, you brought up, I just lost my train of thought, of course. Well, I think getting allies, first of all, I think is a great idea too, because there are also people willing to have that. But you brought up schools, you know, white schools, for example. It's very important there. And we talked about why this is a global society. Also, this is a problem in America. It's not just a Black problem. And so for all of those reasons, I think it's very important that in rural places we have those conversations. But I can also imagine, as the only teacher of color there, that would be a difficult position to be in, to feel like that's just your responsibility. And I think getting, I'm sure there are other people who also understand the importance of it, who maybe you could bring in and help with an equity team or something to help start those conversations in the school.
And I think it's also, and I agree with both of you, important that the leadership within your school corporation, the very top, you know, getting superintendents, principals to buy in, and, you know, elected school boards sensitized and really providing leadership in this regard and holding them accountable. Because in many instances, if leadership doesn't get it, we know there's a great deal of freedom that can happen within classrooms and in schools, good, bad, and indifferent for that matter. But if leadership has bought in, they have some ownership of this issue, it has a way of penetrating and permeating, I think, the system, that it becomes a corporate value and a priority. And so the more that leadership can, again, be brought leading the charge on this, I think the better outcomes we'll see, because they become expectations. And like when Pat was saying that if a teacher essentially cannot meet the task when it comes to something that has been determined as so essential to the life and the integrity of the school and what the school stands for, then he or she needs to go in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now I don't agree with everything that's going on with the leadership in the IPS, but there's one thing that I see happening that maybe I haven't seen happening before, and that is that this racial equity mindset is a top priority with this administration. We have equity training where teachers, and well, not just teachers, it's got to be the entire school district, because there are more people that touch the lives of these students than just us. Bus drivers, people who work in the cafeteria and so forth are able to go through this 2-day racial equity training, and this training is serious training. Also, now, this has never happened before, at every principal's meeting, I am there to talk to them and to help them feel more comfortable having conversations about race when they go back to their school. Because, of course, in our school district, we have about, I'd say, almost 90% white teachers. And so it's very, very important that they feel comfortable having these conversations. And it's even more important that the educational leader in that school is able to show them this is important to me, because they set the tone for the whole school. This is important to me. This is important to this district, and we got to get it. They are in, I guess within the next month, we will have a racial equity policy also.
I saw a question that asked, how do we entice or incentivize more educators of color to join the ranks? Any thoughts about that, Dawn or Pat?
Say that again. I was reading a question.
How do we recruit or entice more Black and brown to be teachers?
We really need that to happen. I think one thing that needs to happen more is that people in HR need to be traveling to HBCUs, for one thing, to recruit. And I'm talking about African-American teachers from HBCUs. That used to happen. I don't see it happening that much anymore, because it makes a difference when students are able to see people who look like them in decision-making positions. It makes a difference to white students when they are able to see people of color in decision-making positions. That'll help them look at them in a different way also. So it is extremely important that that happens.
Yeah, I agree with the importance, and I was going to suggest the HBCUs as well. It's actually something that our district is currently working on. But I also think that the question was also, how do we get more Black students to go into the field of education? And I think that's a really important question to ask too, because we definitely need more. And I don't know the answer to that. And some of that, I think, does go back to that, how we see ourselves, that, you know, patterns that we start learning early on. So I think we need to start showing these students in our classes who they can be as educators, and you know, plant that seed.
And the few teachers of color that we do have to be talking very positively about the profession instead of negatively, so that students will want to be a part of who we are.
There's a question in the chat about, to that point of, how do we help open the hearts and minds of our students who come to class with those deeply ingrained prejudice based off of what they experience at home? There have been several that have asked for some ideas in that area.
Excellent, which finally gets back to the question that I conflated earlier when I was going with parents being kids' first teachers. So yes, how do we deal with what's going on in the household, values, beliefs that show up at the classroom door?
I used to tell my second graders to go home and teach your parents everything you're learning here in this classroom. And because I was known for teaching Black history. I remember I had one parent that came and said, my child is never gonna learn anything about his white history, because all you teach about is Black history. I said, that is not true. Come with me. And I showed her the textbooks that were all white to let her know there is never any problem. Your child will be learning white history as well as every other student. But that's the way I would work with my parents, to make them feel, if they came in with a complaint, they ended up coming back even more to just work in the classroom, because I welcomed them all the time so that they could understand what was going on and learn from what I was teaching their children about people who were different from themselves.
Yeah, I think this is another structural thing that we need to work on too. I mean, there, you know, instead of Black History Month, we need to look back at the systems of, you know, the textbooks we're using are 99% white. They need to have history, everyone's history is part of every book. And as English teachers, we need to go beyond just our Hemingway and Steinbeck and get into Zora Neale Hurston and James Baldwin. And so, you know, another thing that our district is doing, that curriculum audit. We have to look at not just one class, not just English and not just history, but as a district, what does our curriculum look like, and does it represent the students and society? Because they need that. And you know, kids are a summary of all of their experiences. So they, yes, of course, they're going to be impacted by their home life, but they're also impacted by looking at us and learning from us, and reading. Reading helps us empathize. They have to read. They have to read. And so their exposure to other people and other cultures and history can certainly help combat what's going on at home.
And might I also just say that I think it's very important for us as educators to know how to act when parents do come to school. I see examples of, instead of parents being welcomed into the school, they're so busy being judged that they aren't being welcomed. If I see a parent coming in pajama bottoms, I'm not going to say, you go back home, you aren't dressed right. I'm going to say, a parent, come in, come on in here. But they're so busy being judged instead of welcomed. And I think that's a problem we have to look at.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of comments too about all, you know, it's not just English, it's world languages, and it's art, and it's music.
Across the curriculum.
Absolutely, across the curriculum. I love that. Absolutely.
And it's science and math as well. Yes.
Yes.
How has, as we think about inequities, and maybe even just the technology gap, but since we've all been thrust into this COVID-19 way of life, what have you seen, or what do you think will be the things that we will need to be particularly sensitive to as many families, all of us having been affected in one way or another with a new reality, which presents even probably greater challenges for under-resourced families that are needing to access education and in many ways through technology in order to receive instruction. What are the challenges and opportunities there, particularly along racial equity?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of disparity.
Or is it business as usual?
No, I think you're right. There's a lot of concern, right? You know, the end of the school year with so many students doing remote learning, and some schools where one-to-one technology and every student has a Chromebook or access to Wi-Fi, and then the students who don't have access are falling behind again. And so I think that's a very valid question, especially if this continues, and who knows what this upcoming school year is going to look like. And we all know as educators that having students in front of us in the seats is the very best way to interact with them and engage with them and get them to learn and grow. And so doing that remotely has its challenges anyway, but when it's a technology disparity, we have students who are, you know, I saw students fall off who just checked out. And I'm at a school where we have one-to-one technology and remote hotspots for students and community partners where they could go for Wi-Fi and things like that. So I can only imagine what it would look like where there isn't that access.
Oh, well, since you brought up COVID-19, I think that people should be asking themselves why Black and brown people are the most affected by this, because that will definitely bring in racism in terms of how this structural strand of racism runs through everything, health, everything. And this is why you see more Black and brown families being affected by this. And I just don't know if people are really asking themselves why this is happening.
I'm going to detour for a second and go back to what you said. It's tied to even issues around the COVID-19. One of the things that even Martin Luther King, I'm going to botch how he stated it, but he essentially put some caution around the moderate, self-proclaimed moderate person who, in many cases, think that they get it, but when it comes to really having to pick a side, maybe not so much. And where I'm going with this is that I run across a lot of white socially liberal folks, but when it comes time to educate their children, they make very different decisions relative to putting them in schools where there are significant number of students of color. And so I guess if there's a question in that, is even for those, regardless of where they might be politically, but are we still in 2020 any different from Pat, what you said, which is so very true? The reason why, and even here in Indianapolis public school systems and UniGov, why we have 9 different township school districts is essentially because white people did not want to have their children educated alongside Black and brown kids. I mean, so my question is, what's different today than it was 50 or 60 years ago, even longer than that now, for Brown versus Board of Education, where in many instances our schools, because of our housing patterns, redlining and everything else, dictate where we have what educational choices that we often have. And our schools are just as racially segregated, if not more, than they were 50 or 60 years ago. So I guess my question to you, if there is a question in that very long statement, how are we any different as a country when it comes to white and Black and brown kids going to school with one another?
I'm gonna let somebody else answer that. I got the answer, but
I feel like not enough, and I don't think enough has changed, if anything, to be honest. I think it may be different terminology now, and it may look slightly different, but I think it's all still there, and that it all boils down to the systemic racism we talked about earlier. And that's why it's so important that everybody is having this conversation, and that inside school, outside of school, with family members, with friends, in society and out, we have to have these conversations, because we have to do it in our schools for our students, obviously, but it goes beyond that. And we do have to start figuring out how we can start breaking down. The primaries are a perfect example. And all of the issues that happened in certain districts that I find very, very disturbing. And I think it's the same, the redlining that we talked about, it's all still happening.
nothing, very little has changed. Very little.
And why is that?
Because
And does it give you much of any hope for the future if we haven't come as far as we possibly could have, maybe?
And it's almost like we go forward 3 steps, then we go backward 20 steps every time.
Yeah.
Get your, you start saying, oh, finally, like what's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like things are gonna change a little bit. I'm seeing some different scenarios going forth. I'm seeing some, and so my hopes are up, but I'm scared to even let my hopes get up, because it seems like every time things look like they're beginning to change and equity is really being looked at seriously, then the forces that be the demonic characters start coming out and doing their thing. So I'm glad I believe in prayer. That's all I got to say.
Dr.
Going back
Twyman.
to this question around systemic and structural issues and what we can do, and I just want to ask this question, not necessarily of the panel, if anybody else has a response to it as well, and then I'll be glad to tackle it. But the way we fund schools here in Indiana, and thank you, Dan, for the question, is an antiquated system of property taxes. It, by design, will build racial and social economic inequity.
That's
just
true.
straight up.
Absolutely agree.
And
so what, if anything, exactly. So what, if anything, do we do to get the system changed so that there might be a greater opportunity to work in a structure that allows for schools to be resourced in a more equitable manner?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Obviously, we have to engage politically in the process, aside from just voting. I mean, people need to be letter writing and phone calling and, you know, being a part of the process. And that's the only way that we're going to facilitate that change. And it's a very important change to make. There's only so much you can do when you're talking about, well, there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do with our curriculum and things like that, but to actually have equity in our school systems, you're right, we have to change that funding. And that's gonna come with political engagement.
A lot of political engagement.
Yes.
Years and years ago, when I was president of IEA, Ron, we were working on the same thing. From way back when, we have been working on. Can you still hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
We've been working on this inequity in funding, particularly when it came to Indianapolis. But it's really all across the board, the inequity.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
And
Laquita is telling us that we've gone over time, and I think she's trying to interrupt us for Q&A. Is that correct, Laquita?
Q&A or I know you may have had a few more points that you wanted to wrap up, and so I wanted to give you that time because we're at 5:26.
Yeah, right. Well, that along, I think we've taken most of the questions in real time. There was to be a wrap up with some homework assignment, but I would like, before we do that, if there was one last question, the one I put in the parking lot, which was the more structural question, I think we have hit on that in a number of ways. And I think even the homework assignment speaks to that as well. Is there any other kind of burning issue? I mean, this topic is so loaded, we could be talking about it 24/7 and it still wouldn't be enough. So, you know, I apologize for that, but is there any one other issue or burning question we need to address before we make the transition into the wrap up and the homework assignment for the participants?
I just would like to say that instead of saying we need white allies, now I say we need co-conspirators, because that's exactly what we need.
And I'm going to state it even a little different than that. I have finally come to the conclusion, I guess maybe I've intuitively known it, but I'm hearing it and I'm understanding it in a different way, that racism is a white person's problem.
Yes.
And we just can't fix something that we're essentially a victim of. So to all my colleagues, I just say, step up, just step up.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree.
Thank you for making that point.
Something about the state legislature. I'm just looking at comments real quick. Okay, I will end here, Laquita, and let you guys wrap up from the ISTA standpoint.
Thank you, distinguished panel of Knight, Payne, and Twyman. This is our homework going forward based on the dynamic insight that we've got from our panel. Consider the following actions. Does your school district corporation have a racial equity team or racial equity policies? How are they implemented? What can you do to incorporate racial equity into your classroom? And finally, how can you work in your community to foster partnerships?
Great. And I think there was also a question I saw about how can, well, it may be in the closing, how can people access resources that are available to them for more information? And I think that's right here in the closing.
Ron, do you have any more you needed to share? Or Angie?
No, that's it, President Keith. Thank you.
Certainly.
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. This was amazing. I'm so appreciative. I know this is summertime, and I know that we had a really different end of the year. So I know people are tired. And so I'm so grateful that all of you decided to join us for this conversation. And thank you so much to all the panelists. We really appreciate everything that you did for us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to also echo the thanks to the panelists and to the chairs of our Minority Affairs Committee for their great work. I know there was talk in the chat box about more of this, and yes, that is our intent. And the Minority Affairs Committee, as does the ISTA Board of Directors, we've got a lot to take in after this event and process and begin working on how we continue to move this work forward. And I would just remind us, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. We cannot allow the enormity of this work to paralyze us. And so we have to soldier on in all that we do. And so I just cannot thank enough our panelists and our Minority Affairs Committee. And mi familia, my ISTA family, today is, as Pat said, an important step on our journey. We have so very far yet to go, but we must be brave and courageous in this work. My first meeting as president of ISTA, I spoke to the board and asked for grace that in my effort to learn, I may speak through ignorance. And we have to be courageous in humbling ourselves to our own ignorance as we strive to learn and do better. And folks, our students are counting on us and they are watching us, and we cannot let them down. And so I ask all of you to stay safe and healthy. Let us follow the guidance of our healthcare professionals with the same level of respect that we seek when we speak on public education. We must offer our healthcare professionals that same level of respect. So I encourage you all to wash your hands, wear your mask, keep it a safe distance. We can do this, and we can take to the streets by wearing our mask and keeping a safe distance. We can make it all happen. Thank you all so much again for being a part of this. And And please keep in contact with us and watch for our work as we move forward. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Tomorrow we'll have a full day of sunshine across the area. You see just a few counties, Red, Blackford, and Jay still under that severe thunderstorm watch that goes until 6 o'clock this evening. Right now we've got sunshine and we're expecting sunny skies for tomorrow. We'll see the high at 78 in Lafayette. Sunny, breezy, and cooler and not as humid.
Thanks, Laquita, for all your work on this, along with the MAC folks.
Thank you, Laquita. You were instrumental in getting this accomplished. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks for your support.
Yeah, thank you very much. I had to stick around so I could say bye and thank you. When you asked me about this, and it was a week ago, I really thought it would be like a month from now. I'm so impressed at how quickly this was all put together. I was like, really? Next week? Okay. Great. Love it. I love it. All right. Thank you very much for letting me be a part of it.
Yes. Bravo to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Be safe.
Laquita, are you still there? All right. Thank you, Keith, for your help. We appreciate it.
Certainly. Thank you.
See you later. Bye.